Bruce Bueno de Mesquita's The Predictioneer's Game, Chapter 7, Fast Forward the Present. This chapter does something that I call game theory-ish. This is my own term. And, applied game theory is what Bruce does when he uses his model. And so, if you say applied game theory, presumably you're taking a game, crafting it to reflect a situation and using it. This is my view on this, okay? Um, However, very often the insights of game theory can be used, and so without necessarily crafting a model of the particular situation, right? And so you can say people are in a prisoner's dilemma, and this situation's a prisoner's dilemma. We know that it's the shadow of the future, and incentives to defect are important, et cetera, et cetera. And you could structure an empirical analysis around it, right? And that is what I call game theory-ish, right? And and that's another approach. And so I think this chapter, which does not involve his model, right? That's what's different about this chapter. He's not saying, okay, here's a model of the decision making on an issue. He's saying, here's a situation, and he brings up game theoretic principles and suggests, he analyzes them. In one case, he suggests a proposal for peace and a plan for Israelis and Palestinians to share revenue. And in another, he explains why Arthur Andersen didn't use his suggestions, that he had done a model and had done his thing with a few other folks and made recommendations, and they didn't put them into play. And he's using the insights of game theory to understand that. So, let's take a look at what's going on a little deeper here. He has an Israeli-Palestinian revenue sharing proposal that he makes here. And he argues that land for peace deals suffer from what in game theory is known as a time inconsistency problem, that they are not renegotiation proof. If the Israelis give Palestinians land, they are giving an irrevocable benefit in exchange for future actions, right? And it's like, okay, that is a time inconsistency problem, because once the Palestinians have the land, they can demand more, right? They've still got the ability to do or not do whatever they agreed to do, and so they can try to extract more concessions. They can try to renegotiate the agreement. And so he says all land for peace deals suffer from this. So right there, he uses principles of game theory, but he goes on to craft a renegotiation proof plan. He says, look, this is the problem. Let's talk about a way you could do it. Now, he comes up with an idea that you should share revenue from tourism. And he says, look, tourism is a lucrative industry in the area. That's part of why they're fighting over a lot of this, is that they have very historic, culturally significant sites, and he shows that the tourist revenue, he empirically demonstrates, the size of the revenue and its sensitivity to violence. And he says, look, if you come up with a revenue sharing plan for the Palestinians and the Israelis, where you go into tax revenue and they share from it, then they have a mutual incentive to lower the violence, to keep things, because when the violence goes down, their money will go up. And so he goes through this plan, and you should read that on your own. There are a lot of details in it. And the key thing is he's using these game theory insights to craft it, right? And the plan makes sense mainly through these insights and through the effect on incentives. And so just in doing this and bringing in the last 2 points together, he's focusing on the incentives of all the actors, right? And that is, again, motivated by game theory. It's more implicit here, but when you do game theory and you get used to searching for equilibrium or equilibria, then you learn that you have to consider both all actors simultaneously, right? And they have to have an incentive to do what you expect them to do, right? If you're coming up with an agreement, they're, implicit to coming up with an agreement is that there's a strategy, right? That you're going to do what the agreement says. That's a strategy. Another strategy is, no, I won't do it, right? It's the old cooperate defect thing. And you have to have, for both people to cooperate, it has to be in their interest to do that, right? If the other one is doing it, right? That's always the proviso. And that is implicit in his informal argument, right? So he's looking at it and he's applying the concept of equilibrium here, never actually saying it, right? Also, the thing that's really interesting about this chapter is there is no model, there is empirical analysis, and there's data, right, that he uses to establish establish or assess. If you were looking at someone else's program, if someone else had proposed this idea, you might be assessing the viability of the plan, but it's empirical analysis that's guided by this game theory-ish approach. And so I look at this example as, hey, look, here is a model, an example of how you apply game theory in principle to analyze a question and to analyze the future, right? And to identify the problem and then to say, okay, here's a proposal. Would this work? And then you use empirical analysis of past data to say, okay, how would it have worked here? Or is the key causal mechanism going to work, right? And you can actually make an estimate of and he does in this book, in this chapter, make an estimate of how much money would be at stake, right? If there was violence or not violence. And that provides an empirical insight. And again, he's predicting the future, right? He's fast forwarding the present, as he says, but he is predicting the future. And this is always, a problem. When we do empirical research, how do you take data from the past to predict the future? And so this is an example without a big game or computer simulations or certainly no math here. Okay. Incentivizing ignorance. The second example in this is, and I just love that title, right? Incentivizing ignorance. It's a fraud example. And he talks about not using a model. And again, he's going into his bag, and he's, in this case, because the company's gone, he can name names. And he talks about, hey, we worked for Arthur Andersen, and they contracted Bruce and some other scholars to come up with a model for predicting fraud, right? And Arthur Andersen was getting clients and was somewhat concerned about if a client of theirs that they audit commits fraud, right, gives them false information, and they go out and say, yeah, they're doing great, and then they, later on they can be sued. And in fact, Arthur Andersen got caught up in Enron and was driven out of business by prosecution. The thing is, though, that Bruce said, we gave them the fraud indicator, we gave them the model, and they didn't use it, right? Why didn't they use it? So even though the model is mentioned here, right, or actually it's a different model than he normally uses, but it's his, it goes more into the selectorate theory side of things, but he talks about the incentives that the company had, and this is, again, he's focusing on the incentives within the corporations, and he has an informal analysis that is structured around game theory principles. And this is, again, an application. Maybe not, if someone had done what he did on the Palestinian example with that much detail, that would be getting close to a conference or if you're a student of mine, a capstone paper. You're in the ballpark there, right? And you need to dress it up differently. But I was looking at that going, if someone did this, would they pass the capstone? And I was like, well, they might very well. In this, the second example is more just interesting. This is the kind of thing you do with the game theory, right? So this one is how you look at things and how you can understand the world, right? And you can look at it and say, hey, look at this example of executives being willfully ignorant, right, of whether or not fraud is being committed, choosing to be willfully ignorant, because they don't have an incentive to do it. They would rather not know. They also have this time problem that, part of the big problem was many of the key decision makers, they bring in a company and, maybe it committed fraud, maybe it didn't. By the time, the fraud would be discovered and then litigation would occur, the person who brought the company in as a client was gone. It would be retired and probably, live in life. This is actually something that's in different form. This is similar to what's known as the Commonwealth effect, right? And the point is, this is just a useful idea in life, right? And I would say that the second example is, kind of how having this stuff in your head helps you to go through life and to look at things. And certainly within an organization, it points out you should be aware of this. You should be aware that you're creating incentives, and that your incentives that, are going to have an impact on what people did. Now, this is in many ways more decision theoretic because we aren't talking simultaneously looking at incentives and trying to figure out something close to an equilibrium here. This is more decision theoretic when you say, okay, here's our organization, and our rules or how we do business. Are we creating perverse incentives for other people, right? And it's a partial equilibrium. You're fixing the policy. Here's what we're doing. So that's not going to change, right? This is a what if, and then you just that simplifies. Hey, okay, what are the incentives of other people? What are their best responses to this? And do we like that, right? Because you're kind of at that point saying, well, all right, would this policy be in equilibrium for us, right? If you're taking that point of view. Point though is it's another application, and so it's another kind of interesting use of game theory that's provided here. So this chapter, kind of interesting, does something very different than many of the others.